Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Is the microphones working properly and everything? Yes, I think they are. Hello, and welcome to the last session of this Iraq Initiative conference. I'm Liz Sly. I was based in Iraq for many years in the 2000s and 2010s, working for the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune before that. And I actually first went to Iraq in 1990 and 91 during the first Gulf War. So it's very interesting to see how Iraq's developed and changed over all this time. And of course, this is, and we're going to be discussing Iraq's regional role and its role in the international community. And of course, it's a particularly interesting time to do that with the change in administration in Washington. It's probably a bit hard to say what's going to happen because Trump can be so unpredictable, but it also raises some very, very interesting questions about what turn Iraq's going to take now. I would just want to say one small thing that I find particularly interesting about this new administration coming in, which is that when I was there in the 2000s, of course, I met a lot of the young men, boys, they were children basically, who came out, deployed to Iraq. It was obviously a profound experience for a lot of them. And I used to think, how is this going to affect their lives when they grow up? It wasn't a happy experience for a lot of them. And this new administration features a vice president and presumably a new defense secretary who were among those young men who deployed to Iraq in the 2000s. I don't know whether that will, how that will affect this administration's policy. But certainly one thing we can say is that there will be key people in positions there who are familiar with Iraq and do know Iraq. So they're going to have opinions. What they will be, we don't know. So anyway, yes, I'm going to jump in now with the questions and from this esteemed panel. And I'm going to start with Krikor, sitting on my left. He is the Director General of the Department of International Affairs for the Iraqi government. And Krikor, I'd like to open up just by asking you where US-Iraq relations stand at the moment. What can you tell us about the agreement for the so-called withdrawal, drawdown, rebalancing of the US troops in Iraq, and whether you are anticipating big changes to any of that under Trump?
Thank you, Liz. Where is the Iraqi-American relations? It's in transition. We are trying to predict scenarios of where this is heading. There are some of us who are optimists about the future of this relationship, others who are a bit concerned on where this relationship will go. You mentioned that there are several officials who have served in Iraq or who have an experience in serving in Iraq. Therefore, they know Iraq. You said this and portrayed this in a positive way. This, to a certain extent, worries me because they know an Iraq that is completely different than the Iraq of today. And I am not scared, but petrified that they will make their assumptions and their decisions based on that experience without realizing that Iraq is a country that has been in transition for 20 years. And day after day, you see change in Iraq. So that worries me. On the positive side, when President Trump was elected, won the elections, the Prime Minister asked for a phone call to congratulate him. And the phone call took place. The President-elect was politically very astute, culturally very understanding, very respectful, had nice things to say about the Prime Minister and about Iraq and Iraq's role in the region, and said that I look forward to working with you and your government on some of the issues of concern, including the conflict. And the conversation was promising. There is another promising aspect about the bilateral Iraqi-American relationship, that it's more of an institutionalized relationship. We have a strategic framework agreement. We have the Joint Coordination Committee. We have the High Coordination Committee, which we have yearly meetings between the two governments. This government has restructured the HCC from our side, trying to cover all areas of relationship, pushing it beyond the security relationship to include economic, political, humanitarian, health, educational, cultural. So what members of our team call a 360-degree relationship. So trying to expand this relationship. We are hoping that the Iraqi government and Iraq will get a chance to present the positive change to the American administration. What has taken place in Iraq? And hear the perspective of the government before they make up their mind. It concerns me that I hear about executive orders that are going to take place in the early era of the administration. And maybe that will negatively impact Iraq and the Iraqi government's efforts in maintaining the relationship and in putting Iraq on the right track. About your second question, and I'm sorry if I've taken more than I should, the issue of withdrawal of American troops. I think I would rephrase the question. In 2014, an international coalition was assembled to fight ISIS. America was the key member of that coalition. So the troops withdrawal, what you call the troops withdrawal, what we call the end of the mission to fight ISIS, of the global coalition to fight ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. So this is what we have agreed upon. It's a professional military-to-military issue based on the assessment of the level of the threat, the capabilities of the Iraqi security forces, and the environmental threat. So it's not a political decision. It's not an Iraqi-American decision. This government, thankfully, in terms of institutionalizing the bilateral relations, has been able to set up in conjunction with our American colleagues, with very capable and gifted diplomats in Baghdad and the ambassador in Baghdad, and with between the Department of Defense and the Iraqi Ministry of Defense, what we call the Joint Security Cooperation Dialogue, which is a longer-term security avenue for security partnership between the two countries, where we can share information, where we can cooperate and continue this cooperation. And I hope that this would continue under this administration. I have no reason to believe that this would be reversed.
So moving on to Denise Natalie, who served in the first Trump administration, I want to flip that question. CRICO says there's no reason to believe anything will be reversed or changed, or at least they're hoping not. Is there reason for that? Hoping not. Is there any reason to believe there will be any significant change in direction in terms of US-Iraq relations now that the new administration is coming in?
First, thank you. And I have to just state that these are my views and they don't represent the government, the Department of Defense, or the National Defense University, or the next Trump administration. Cricker, I agree with a lot of what you said. I want to give you an understanding of where I see the next administration, how they're approaching the Middle East and our engagements in the world in general. It is not, in addition to you want the Trump administration to look at Iraq differently, they're coming into this, many of them, or most of them, in reaction to the spectacular failure of the United States in Iraq, the Americans' spectacular failures in Afghanistan. This is a foreign policy based on realism and restraint for a good part, a large wing of the next President-elect Trump. So in addition to, yes, Iraq has changed, this component of that Trump, the people who support Trump and the whole Trump administration, I see, is recoiling back from any form of liberal interventionism. That is dead. Nation building, democracy promotion, regime change, that is over. That had started with the Obama administration, actually. This is not something that's new with the Trump administration. This has been going on, so it's much deeper. It's been going on, again, since the end of the Obama administration, through Trump 1, through Biden, and this will likely continue again. So that's number one. This is where most are regarding the way we're going to engage with Iraq. But the priorities in the Middle East, and this is the way I see them looking at Iraq, and it may not be satisfying to people here, but here are the priorities. End the war and Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hezbollah, end that war. Abraham Accords, and deter Iran. And this is not maximum pressure, it's called ultimate maximum pressure. And I'm not kidding, it is called ultimate maximum pressure. So this is going to be more than 1,500 sanctions against Iran like we did last time. It's not turning an eye to the 90% of Iranian oil that's going to China. It's seizing the boats. It's aggressively, not allowing this oil to offload, to economically strangle Iran's economy so that these revenues can, not go to these other groups and things like that. So this is where the approach is to the Middle East. And by the way, Israel remains a staunch and very important ally. But I also do not see President-elect Trump giving Prime Minister Netanyahu carte blanche. He says, end the war, do what you have to do and end the war quickly. So back to Iraq. How does this affect Iraq? Looking at Iraq through the prism of these issues. How can Iraq help us advance X? How can Iraq, help stabilize or, the end of a negotiated settlement or the Abraham Accords? This is where the priorities will be, because overall, the key foreign policy priority is going to be China, Indo-Pacific, and of course, these three key issues. And I'll leave it on.
So that's a good place to leave it, because next I'm going to turn to Mr. Wang Guangda, who is the Executive Director of the China Arab Research Center on Reform and Development at Shanghai International University. Mr. Wang, I would like to ask you to tell us very generally, China has actually made huge inroads into Iraq in terms of investment, influence, its presence. It's just done a sweep of the new oil bids, I understand. I'd like to get a sense from you of where China fits into all of this in Iraq and how a Trump administration might affect China's role in Iraq, given the extensive presence it has there, but also the strong likelihood that you're going to have a lot of, I don't know if it will be called ultimate maximum pressure, but certainly some sort of increased pressure on China from the Trump administration.
I will speak Arabic.
I will speak in Arabic. I will thank the chair and I will thank Chatham House for inviting me, for your generous invitation. As you might be aware, the history, the legacy of the Chinese-Iraqi relation go to more than 1,000 years. And in fact, some of the cities were built thanks to the trade with China, such as Al-Basra. In the modern times, the relation started since 1958. And in 2015, we initiated or we started our strategic relationship. So this strategic relationship is important, which is based on equality, equal footing, and mutual respect, and mutual interests, and non-intervention in domestic and internal affairs. And we also look at Iraq and consider Iraq as a pivotal and vital state in the region, and as an important state or country along the Silk Road. As the chairperson mentioned, that between China and Iraq, there are many collaborative projects. First of which, we collaborate in petrochemical and hydrocarbon sector. Iraq now exports 1 million barrels of oil to China. And this is a huge amount, which constitutes 30 to 50% of the Iraqi exports of oil, say. And in the future, if things went to plan, this is set to increase. In addition to exporting oil to China, is not in China's interest only, but of course, its revenues come into interest of the two peoples of the two countries. We also contribute to the reconstruction of Iraq, as we know. In 2019, an agreement has been concluded, which is oil in return for reconstruction in exchange. We have contributed to many infrastructure projects, and in building schools. We built thousands of schools in Iraq. We also contributed to power plants construction. As far as I know, nearly 50% of the power of the electricity in Iraq is generated by Chinese companies in Iraq currently. In addition, we contribute and participate in water treatment and water drainage projects and water and hospitals. Iraq is also a vital partner in the initiative of Belt and Road. So most of the projects come under the umbrella of this initiative, and through trade relationships, by the end of last year, the trade between two countries amounted to $55 billion US, increasing 43% in comparison to 2020. And it is in favor of Iraq. I mean the balance, the trade balance. And this comes on equal footing and mutual interest. And I've always say that when interests and when we think of interest, we think we should take the entire world into consideration, because our interest is the interest of the Iraqi people. And by this I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so I'm going to come back to some of the things you said a bit later. And I want to move now to Mohammed Ali Shabani, who is the editor of the excellent online publication Amwaj Media. And to turn to the topic that's like the front burner across the region at the moment, which is the Gaza war, the Israel-Hezbollah war, and then Iran's role in those. I'd like to know how you see, well, certainly it seems that fears that Iraq would get deeply caught up in this conflict don't seem to have materialized at the moment, and there seems to be a kind of understanding between Iran and the US to kind of leave Iraq out of it. Do you see that surviving the incoming Trump administration? And how do you see, in what ways do you see Iran kind of adjusting its posture or preparing to adjust its policies to cope with an incoming administration that's going to bring about ultimate maximum pressure?
Thank you so much, Adam Haas, for organizing this timely event. To continue on the topic that you mentioned, I think it's really vital to think about what happened the previous time Trump was in office. And we saw multiple events involving Iran and Iraq. First of which was the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. That happened in January 2020. That resulted in US forces for the first time since, I believe, the Second World War, coming under a missile bombardment by a nation state. That had never happened before for over 60 years. So that broke a taboo. And we've seen a similar kind of mechanism over the past 8 months with Iran and Israel. Iran now, as a nation state, is directly firing missiles at Israel multiple times. So we have completely different dynamics. The Middle East that was evident in 2020 is no longer there. It's a completely different region, different rules. Another thing I think really important to look at under Trump 1 was what happened in September 2019, a few months before the assassination of Soleimani. And that happened just across the border from Iraq with Saudi oil facilities. The Houthis claim responsibility for missile strikes. However, other studies later showed that the missiles actually fired from the north. Now, there is dispute about whether the missiles were fired from inside Iran or from Iraqi territory. But what we do know is that after that attack, there was no US response. The US was nowhere to be found. And I think that has fundamentally changed the GCC views of Trump in particular and the US in general. And apart from that, I would say that with reference to Iraq, the understanding of Iran has long been that the US has no Iraq policy. It has an Iran policy, and as a bracket of that Iran policy, there's Iraq. And that's it. Priorities have completely changed now. And I think interest in Iraq has also completely changed. And I believe probably the panelists will agree that the U.S. has no appetite to go into Iraq. They're going to seek as much restraint as possible. Now, how do you reconcile these things with Trump too, right? If he's going to go in the region, he's going to go for maximum pressure. Sorry, ultimate maximum pressure, right? Is Iran just going to sit there? So what we've seen over the past 12 months after October 7th is a lot of the nightmare scenarios that a lot of people were talking about or thinking about actually happening. So one of these nightmare scenarios is that the U.S. is now facing a level of coordination among the members of the so-called axis of resistance to a level that, again, many people saw as the worst nightmare. And you can dispute the level of it, but the reality of it is that we have now groups in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, coordinating their actions. So if the U.S. is going to ramp up pressure, ultimate maximum pressure, it will resist, Iran will resist, it will probably come up with ultimate maximum resistance. And how will that look? It's going to be very different from January 2020 when Iran itself attacked, right? I think so far I agree with your notion that Iran and the U.S. have agreed to put a lid on things inside Iraq. But here I would say, and connected to Trump 1 with maximum pressure, which is that prior to Trump, Iraq was a national kind of a strategic priority for Iran. When Trump came in, he tried to cut off Iranian access physically to global markets. So what was Iran left with? Its neighbors, its physical neighbors. Because you can attack the ships, you can stop the ships, you can go after the banks. What we cannot do is to control the Iran-Iraq border. There's no way of doing that. So thanks to Trump, Iraq became Iran's second biggest trade partner. So it became an actual economic imperative for Iran to be present in Iraq in a whole other way than Iran, I think, actually wanted it from the get-go, right? So if we look at that dynamic, and if Trump is now talking about what would probably constitute acts of war to go and capture actual Iranian ships on the high seas, you're going to see Iran probably go deeper into the region. And this may disrupt the formula of keeping a lid on things in Iran. And I think probably it's a good idea to leave things there.
So, yes, so to follow up on that, I'd like to turn to Denise now, because you said it's the end of liberal interventionism, it's the end of regime change, it's the end of getting involved in foreign wars, all those things. But at the same time, it's ultimate maximum pressure on Iran. If Iran responds to ultimate maximum pressure with ultimate maximum resistance, does that not make for a contradiction in Iraq where the inclination is to leave it alone, get out, never get involved again? And what would you see a Trump administration doing if it, in those circumstances? Isn't it entirely possible that Iran could just drive the Americans out of the region, taking advantage of Trump's lack of appetite for involvement?
Sure. Can I just respond just to Mohammed for a bit? The last time President-elect Trump was in office, there were no wars for 4 years started in the Middle East, or wars did not exacerbate. And that did not happen since Jimmy Carter, just to clarify that. Secondly, maximum pressure, I should have clarified. Ultimate maximum pressure is, in addition, it's economic, it's diplomatic, and it's military. So this is not, one option is, ultimate maximum pressure and going through the sanctions, and this is also contingent on continued attacks on American troops, building up the nuclear capabilities, all of these things. But it also could lead to diplomatic engagement, and I'm talking about, hey, for 10 months you don't do this, we will lift this. I could see that is an option as well. Another option, again, is the threat of some type of military, use of military force. That is not engaging a liberal intervention in the sense of we are going to put boots on the ground. We are going to try to change the nature of governance. But these are the options. This is why I should have started with, they're using, the phrase is peace through strength. And this means deterrence. So one of the big aspects of the foreign policy is to shore up our deterrence. Deterrence means to have enough economic and military power to prevent people from acting in certain ways. So, and I don't think that there's a contradiction. And again, sanctions, there's been tons of studies on, sanctions don't really work and they haven't changed behavior. You have to look at, are the sanctions, what are they implemented, and what kind of policies are being implemented alongside sanctions? Are our partners and allies implementing these sanctions as well? But that is, there is not, and this is not new to the Trump administration. Like I said, this has been going on for over a decade in American foreign policy, which is we're not going to get into these deep, get inside the state and start, maneuvering or social engineering or political engineering the way states should be so we can fix them. But it does mean having viable security partners. I see more of a move toward bilateral relationships and partnerships than I do multilateral ones. President-elect Trump was never a big fan of multilateral relationships that don't benefit the United States, i.e., redo the climate agreement doesn't benefit us. Trade agreements, multilateral trade agreements don't really benefit us. So think bilateral agreements, think again how these partnerships in the Middle East can advance Abraham Accords, ending the conflicts, the wars in the Middle East, and containing Iran. And
So
which is again could be diplomatic as well.
So, yes, I want to touch on the Abraham Accords in a little bit, but I'd like to ask Kriko at the moment, listening to all of this, what does Iraq think? Because also there's a kind of contradiction in Iraq. You have Iranian-backed groups who have vowed to get the Americans out of Iraq at all costs. But the inclination of the Iraqi government seems to be to keep them there. You mentioned that some people are optimistic about what Trump might bring and the change of administration, but some people are pessimistic, and you spoke about being petrified of the thought of these people who knew an earlier Iraq being in office. What does Iraq want out of this? What would be your ideal scenario given all these different factors? And what is your worst? What do you fear might go wrong?
I did not. You said that there are factions within Iraq that want the Americans out, and by the Americans out, you mean the American embassy?
I mean I think they don't mean the embassy. I think they mean the military presence. Yes.
The military presence has a military objective. By the way, to go back, factually speaking, there is an international coalition with advisors that are helping the Iraqi security forces. The mission of these advisors is to help the Iraqi security forces to achieve victory against ISIS. If and when this mission is achieved, then this global coalition will cease to exist, regardless of what the factions want or don't want. At the end of the day, what Iraq does in terms of foreign policy, what kind of military relations it builds, is the decision of the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government realizes that Iraq is still a special case, that monopoly over the means of violence is not completely achieved yet. It's a work in progress, and I stress that it is a work in progress. In terms of number and the scope of operations of violent non-state actors, it is going down. One of the diversions was what happened a year ago, but at the end of the day, if Iraq is to become a sovereign state, it needs to maintain monopoly over the means of violence. The Prime Minister yesterday repeated that. The decision of war and peace is the decision of the Iraqi government. The ultimate Shia authority on this planet, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, said the state must maintain monopoly over the means of violence. Most of these factions are, at the end of the day, are also Shias. Iraqis, in general, are proud of their identity. Now, I am going to be realistic. The further or the more polarized the relationship between the United States of America and Iran, the more destabilized Iraq becomes, and the more difficult it becomes for the government of Iraq to maintain its balance. It is in the interest of the Iraqi government to have some sort of a détente between the Americans and the Iranians. And it wants to play such a role. It is in its interest. And when you talk to some of the political elites in Iraq, some of the key figures in the governing coalition, they see President-elect Trump as a person who is interested in these at the end of the day, and who would be interested in Iraq can play such a role. And ultimately that would help the stability and security of Iraq and the region. It might be a pipe dream, I don't know, but this is how Iraqis are thinking and hoping.
So that's what you're hoping on. So what is your worst fear when you mentioned people being pessimistic and worried and people being optimistic? What's your fear that the Trump administration will do that would not be to Iraq's benefit?
One of our fears from the Trump administration is to look at Iraq through the security prism, or through the prism of Iran. Failure to see that Iraq is the only state in the Middle East where people from different ethnic, sectarian, and religious backgrounds come together to share power and resources. Procedurally speaking, Iraq is a democracy now in the heart of the Middle East, where the choices usually are between either chaos or dictatorship, because the concept of a nation state was exported, not indigenous in the region. But Iraq is developing these political institutions and is moving along these lines. Mohammed Shia al-Sudani is today the prime minister. Tomorrow, he might be out of office. But his legacy will be that he made an important shift in Iraqi politics. And I hope the Americans would also see that. Iraqi politics was, in the beginning, based on identity, consociational politics. Mohammed Shia al-Sudani made the push to transfer this, to transition towards substantive politics, from identity-based politics to substantive politics. And now, in the upcoming elections, all political parties think about what can they offer to the Iraqi electorate. Therefore, you see X party or Y party that used to run on its identity platform, on identity platforms. Now, in the governorates that they control, or they have the governor, they want to present this as an example to the Iraqi people. This is a major step on the way of consolidating Iraq's democracy. And we hope that the Americans would get to see this, not to see Iraq as an extension of Iran, sanction the central bank, sanction SOMO, get out of there, go up north, and just cut off Iraq.
And the plan is there for the troops to go north, though, right? And to leave Iraq. That is part of the plan,
Again,
is that right?
The advisors of the international coalition, according to the timetable that is agreed between the two militaries, will maintain a presence to support the mission in Syria until September 2026. That was what was agreed upon in the HMC, which is the High Military Commission.
And very quickly, Denise, Trump kind of abruptly pulled all the troops out of Syria in 2019 and then changed his mind and they stayed, but in a smaller bit than they were before. Do you see any abrupt changes of departures from the existing track?
Actually, it wasn't Trump who changed his mind. It was the neoconservatives and the conservative war hawks who had wanted to keep our troops there. So, the inclination of some of the Trump base is to get out. Now, with that said, no, I do not see a precipitous withdrawal from Syria. And again, look at the debacle, the catastrophe of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that rings very loudly among many Americans. So any type of withdrawal of these troops from Syria will be deliberate. It will be done when the conditions are set. And this is not there to counter ISIS now. This is about countering Iran. So, there has to be, immediately, when Turkey normalizes relations with Assad, who is going to be replacing these troops so that we can assure that, these Iranian-backed groups are not going to gain influence? What about the prisoners? This is a very long process, but I do not see a precipitous withdrawal because it would be then on the backs of the Trump administration for this destabilization.
So, Mohammed, we have to ask the perennial question, which is with the coalition troops drawing down in Iraq and consolidating and relocating probably exclusively to Kurdistan, do you see ISIS coming back? Is that any risk at all?
The threat of extremism hasn't gone away, but there's dispute about where precisely geographically it may emerge from, where it's most acute in terms of threat. I think from the Iranian perspective, ISIS is defeated in Iraq. And Syria is a situation that's quite different and has different activities there. I think if you look outside that prism and look at the bigger picture of what may drive extremism, many of the pillars have been left unaddressed. And I think Iran is cognizant of that. And I think Iran and the US can play a very important role if you again look at the bigger picture outside just Iraq. And if they can come to some kind of understanding. I understand that the new Trump administration wants to pursue ultimate maximum pressure, and my prediction is that probably may lead to ultimate maximum resistance. But if there's some kind of transactionalism in there, which we have seen under the current administration, the outgoing Biden administration, with de-escalation deals, that can be very helpful. And I think if you're going to go after groups like ISIS or affiliates and the Salafist kind of jihadist sphere, then you would need cooperation and buy-in from other actors as well who are affected, and these include the Syrian government. And this is where you get that tied into the whole GCC equation, the Abraham Accords, right? Because I think Trump, if he seeks peace through strength, and I think the biggest ticket item is Saudi Arabia, obviously, in terms of normalization. I think the one country which can have the biggest practical impact is probably Syria. Now, this may sound crazy. Israel, the idea of them normalizing with Assad, I get it. But just a couple of years ago, Israel and Lebanon negotiated a maritime demarcation deal, right? Some of the discussions being had right now is about a ground border. Now, you can label that however you want, but in effect, that means that there's some kind of recognition there. You want to put it within the box of the Abraham Accord? Sure. You can put it in something else. But the point is, if you look practically and you zoom out a little bit, there is scope for transactionalism there. Do I see a grand bargain? Not sure. Again, depends on how they frame it. I think that when Trump came into office last time, Iran and the US had a deal. They had the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was negotiated with 6 world powers. It was supposed to act as a basis for a second deal on the region. Trump pulled out of that unilaterally. He wanted the Donald Trump international deal instead. Now, if he comes back to the table and says, I want the Donald Trump international deal, call it whatever he wants, and he has all of those elements, and he puts it on the table, you never know.
So let's go back to that just in a little bit, but I want to bring Mr. Wang back into the conversation, because you described very succinctly the extensive interests that China has developed in Iraq over the past decade. Investments in all kinds of sectors, not only oil, but also oil being a very important part of that for China and for Iraq as well. And we know from our history books that the flag follows trade. If we have a repositioning of US troops in Iraq, an international of the coalition, and you know, down the line, security threats do emerge, new security threats. Is there a scenario in which China might be forced to step in with some kind of security arrangements to protect the investments it has? And is China in a position to do that?
شكرا. قد كلنا نتحدث عن الجانب السلبي.
All of us talk about the negative side, the negative impact of Trump on China. But there is another side that is optimistic. We should not forget that Trump is a businessman, a tradesman. He may increase tariffs and taxes on Chinese goods and products, but these will be a burden on the American people and not only on us. In this context as well, because Trump is doing this, we think that there will be some convergence between China and Europe. In addition, we know that Elon Musk is building a factory, a plant in China to make a lot of profit, and this is positive. Anyway, Trump is still Trump, but the world has changed. The world is not as it was before. What I have seen in Trump in 2022, sorry, after the assassination of the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, there was a lot of tension between Iran and the United States, and I think that the US is ready to launch war on Iran, and Trump stopped that war. If there was another term for Trump, which is without a war in the world, then this is worth it. Just like I mentioned with regard to tariffs and taxes, it will be a burden on both sides, not only on China. As for Chinese-Iraqi relationships, China is an independent, fully sovereign country, and Iraq is a sovereign, independent country, and we have to interact normally through the lens of a friend country, and I don't think that Trump will have any impact on our relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, just quickly, I want to ask Krikor, before we go to audience questions, and I have a couple of online questions here. We know Trump likes the Abraham Accords and is very keen to promote those as a central plank of his Middle East policy. Would you see room for Iraq to be included in those?
Legally speaking, Iraq can't do that. Parliament passed a law that bans this. So no.
No, okay. Okay, so now I think we should open up to questions. Yes, let's start with.
Thank you. My name is Aman Charki. My question would be to Mr. Grigor. You mentioned decision of the state, state of peace, of war, or war, must be or stay in the hands of the state, which I believe it should be like that. But there's word out there that the state is not able to control illegal armed forces. That's one. Second, you mentioned that America must not see Iraq as an extension of Iran. But on the other hand, there is word out there, you know about the problem, the USD currency difference between the Iraqi dinar and the American dollars. So what the word is, the dollars that have been given to the Iraqi market on daily basis, the next day we are finding them in Iran, in Yemen, in Lebanon, and then we expect the international community not to put sanctions on the Central Bank of Iraq. What do you have to say for that? Thank you.
As I said, monopoly over the means of violence is one of the essential elements of statehood. And I said it's a work in progress. So the government, day after day, is becoming stronger, is expanding its control, supported by the Iraqi people, and in agreement. It is becoming a part of the social contract in Iraq. The government knows that one of its most important priorities is a proper DDR that would end these violent state actors that operate outside of the scope of the state. There is not a day that goes by that we don't think about this question and about plans to achieve this. As for the second issue, economics is not my specialty. But whatever dollars you're worried about, there is a program that the Americans and the Iraqis are working on, which is called the banking sector reform. Maybe the guys who focus on economy and finance can answer this, but my understanding is that by the end of this year, there will not be any banknotes that will be shipped and end up anywhere. The Iraqi banking system will become like any other banking system in the world, and this concern will be solved if it's true. I don't know. It's something that I don't follow, but I know the dollar auction will end by the end of this year through cooperation between the Treasury and the Iraqi Central Bank and the Federal Reserve.
So, yes, let's go to this man here.
Tamer Badawi, Peace Paradigms. I have this question to Mr. Krikor. So under the Mustafa al-Kadhimi administration, Iraq played a key role in facilitating Iranian GCC dialogues. And now with the potential resurgence of tensions between Iran and GCC countries under a Trump 2.0 administration, how is Iraq under the leadership of Mohammad Shia Sudani positioning itself to navigate and prepare for such a scenario? So, how is Iraq?
Your observation is now there are increasing tensions between the GCC and Iran?
No, I mean, if it happens in the future under a Trump administration, like, how is Iraq now preparing itself for such a situation? How can it play a role in de-escalating the tensions? So it's
I have to think of a phrase because the Prime Minister does not like the word bridge. But Iraq always sees itself as an interested party in having good relations. Iraq has a unique demographic setup. It's a majority Arab Shia state. So it could be a perfect facilitator of cordial relations on the regional level. In January, probably, we will host what is called Baghdad 2025. The major aim of that conference is to create economic interdependencies that would establish mutually beneficial economic interests to tie the relations between these countries. The problem with the Middle East, why is it volatile? Why is it always unstable? Is because of the lack of these interdependencies. So now we're working on extra or transnational projects like the development road. Ties the interests of Qatar, UAE, Iraq, Turkey, Europe, GCC. We're trying to lure in the Iranians too. So it's these kinds of projects that would create some sort of a modus vivendi in the region. And that is one of the priorities of the Iraqi government when it comes to foreign policy.
So I'm just going to switch to to one of the online questions here, then come back to the audience. And this is a question for Denise from Ali Abdullah. How much pressure is it likely that Trump will put on Chinese businesses in Iraq or on the Iraqi government to continue in with its energy and trade deals with China?
Thanks. I don't think President-elect Trump is going to go after China in Iraq. I mean, to start with, again, it's looking at the current trade deals or the current practices by China that President-elect Trump and the administration will regard as disadvantageous to Americans, disadvantageous to the American economy. So intellectual property rights we're starting off looking at. Dumping, tariffs, all of these unfair trade practices. That's where it's going to start. And it will, and some of the people in place, it will be aggressive. But I don't see at this time going after Iraq, going after China in Iraq, is going to be part of that at the moment. And what was the second part of that question?
That was basically it, and whether they would put pressure on the Iraqi government as well, and that you've kind of answered.
No, if there's any, I wouldn't say pressure on the Iraqi government, but again, when there's sanctions imposed, right? When you're imposing sanctions on Russia or Iran, we will then hope that our partners, would reinforce that where they can. But we also know that Iraq has dependencies and waivers have been granted. And so, I could see some of that also at the same time continuing because you don't want to alienate an important ally by putting sanctions on your ally as well. That's not a good way to go forward.
Right, so yes, at the very back there.
Thank you. Paul Raymond, I'm a recovering journalist. Israel's foreign minister sent a letter on Monday to the UN Security Council demanding that the Iraqi state take immediate action to stop armed groups from launching attacks from Iraq and citing Israel's right to self-defense. What do you make of this and of the possibility of an Israeli attack before Trump takes office?
Let's ask Mohammed that question.
Well, we've seen attacks on Israel from Yemen over the past year, and also from Iraq. It's become a regular occurrence. And this goes back to what I said previously about the so-called nightmare scenarios, with these groups being coordinated, deploying weapons that we didn't see during Trump 1. In Yemen, the Israeli response has been bombing of mainly energy facilities, port facilities. And I think for me, what stands out about that is that if you have a scenario in Iraq where something like that were to happen on the part of Israel, the number one victim would be the Iraqi state, which relies on oil exports for 96% of its revenue, right? So if Israel were to take such action in Iraq, I think doing so without the consultation of the Trump administration, knowing the impact on oil markets, I see it as very unlikely. More likely is some kind of targeted assassination, and this has taken place already by U.S. forces. So U.S. forces have taken action inside Iraq over the past year already. We've seen senior commanders of Qatar as well, for instance. So I think the safer bet for Israel is to coordinate with the incoming administration and maybe even hand over the job of the actual hit to U.S. forces, if that makes sense. I would be surprised if they wouldn't. Why wouldn't they?
So, tangentially to that, I'd like to ask you what has been the impact on the Hashachabi, the Iraqi militia groups who've been attacking America but have calmed down on it for some time now, of the immense setbacks dealt to Hezbollah, their ally. You mentioned that we've seen unprecedented coordination of these fronts, but actually we haven't seen a lot of coordination since Hezbollah was the one in the real line of fire. And the Iraqis have been quite quiet about that. Is that because they, I mean, why is that? And has it an impact on their strategic thinking one way or another?
That's a very legitimate question. I think one big question that's come up to many observers over the past year is Hezbollah is a very capable organization. Even now, with the elimination of its senior political and military leadership, it's still fighting on the ground. It's exacting a heavy cost on Israeli forces. Why is it holding back? Even if Israel has taken out an estimated 30% of its missile arsenal, there's another 300,000 projectiles there, at least. Why is it not firing them at Tel Aviv? One of the explanations is that Iran is telling them to hold back. And this goes back to the different views of war. It's Western view of war and non-Western view of war. Western view of war is very much shock and awe, something for the cameras, something instant, and you want to see results immediately. You want to see explosions on TV. The more Iran-centric view of war is attrition. It's a very long process, and it's about exacting a price that will carry political capital that most Western leaders will not pay because they cannot afford it. I remember during the negotiations for the nuclear deal 2015, the US side was saying, we wish we had a supreme leader able to sit and formulate strategic plans for the next 25 years. We have a 4-year window. And even if Trump comes in now, which he will, by the Constitution, unless I'm wrong, he can only serve 4 years. He cannot possibly serve 8 years. So if you're going to make decisions and planning about the region, this certainly will keep this in mind, that there are different time frames, there are different ways of looking at war. So if the Iraqi side, for instance, has not been activated right now, they are active right now. They're actually firing drones almost every day at Israel. But if they haven't been activated against U.S. forces as a form of leverage, I think probably it's because there's a wait-and-see mode. There's a confidence in their capabilities and a lot of calculation about when and how to deploy them. Because keep in mind also that the Iraqi government is their ally. The prime minister is there because they wanted him there, right? So they don't want to shoot themselves in the foot either.
Thank you. So yes, let's ask this man here.
Hi, my name is Sajjad Jiyad. I'm a fellow at Centre International. My question is to Denise. How much attention do you think Iraq will have for the incoming president? Do you think him and his close circle, the loyalists, not people further in the administration, but people that are close to him, do you think they're actually going to give Iraq much attention? Do you think they're going to really think hard about Iraq policy? Or is it more likely that Iraq will suffer some neglect because the Americans have their interests elsewhere?
Great question, Sajjad. one, I think the administration, and this is not just a 4-year blip, because even if a president goes away and the party runs again, many of these same policies will continue. So and I have to just jump in. I'm not in the military, I'm a civilian, but I work enough with the military to know that military strategy is not for shock and awe only to put on TV. This is a very deeply planned, strategies by brilliant strategic leaders to whether it's to decapitate the command and control centers, but it's done in a very calculated way. But Sajjad, even in this administration, if you look at the national security strategy, you have the same elements that have continued for the last several administrations: China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and transnational terrorist organizations. The Middle East has an important part of this, but on paper, it hasn't been a priority. It's been China and the Indo-Pacific. So I keep that in mind, because I think some of this, again, not new to President-elect Trump, that will continue. With that said, look at who's going to be the National Security Council. Who's going to be holding the Middle East dossier, who's going to be holding the Iraq dossier. There are still people who are not going to say, let's entirely forget about Iraq, because it holds too important a place. But as I said to Krikor in the beginning, if I were working on the Iraq dossier or Iraqis, think about where these priorities are of where the President-elect Trump is going to be, right? As I said, Abraham Accords, countering Iran, bringing peace, ending conflict. But there's also, regional integration. President-elect Trump is going to come into the region in a much different way than President Biden did with the Saudis, right? President Biden came in saying we're going to alienate Saudi Arabia, will be a pariah state. President-elect Trump is coming in with deep social, political, and economic capital with the Saudis, with the Gulf. This is a very, very, very important partners that we continue to have. So, where Iraq can continue its regional integration, and it has successfully done over the years, I think that would be a good thing to do as well. But frankly, saying that will Iraq claim the attention of the administration the way that China will? No. Will it be important in situating these other regional objectives? Yes. And there's a final point, and that is, the Iraqi government, as we transition to a new security relationship with Iraq, and that is the end of one chapter toward another chapter based on the Strategic Framework Agreement, there's also responsibilities. Will American forces or American personnel be at threat in Iraq? Is the Iraqi government, can they continue to protect American forces in Iraq? So all of these things play into the importance of this relationship. I don't know if I answered that. Thanks.
Yes, this lady here.
Thank you very much. My question is, I'd like to know how the new U.S. administration is going to deal with non-governmental actors that will undermine any efforts the Iraqi or the Lebanese or any government in the region will make to form ties with the U.S., with the Gulf countries, with various countries, in light of what is happening in Lebanon and Gaza. I mean, there are 2 million Lebanese, displaced Lebanese today. There are 2 million displaced Gazans today, and we don't know what the future is. I mean, what Dr. Sha'bani mentioned, the war goes on. Hezbollah, there's a few brave men continue to fight, but the reality is far worse than that. They are away from their properties, from their homes, and there is total uncertainty in the future. There's a good chance, or their worst fear might come true, is that they will not be able to go back. What is the influence of all this, and how will the new administration deal with it, and especially in Iraq? And I'm not talking state to state. I mean, what yourself and Gregor mentioned is absolutely correct. There's going to be normal relationships, but my concern is how the new administration is going to deal with the non-governmental actors in the region, and especially in Iraq. Thank you. Yes.
Did you say non-governmental Actors, who do you mean specifically?
Just for instance.
Violent non-state groups.
Yes.
Okay. Again, so let me go back to where these 5 priorities, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and transnational terrorist organizations. So the extent to which these groups are destabilized, if they're going after Americans, and what is happening now with the Biden administration, they will hit back, right? But there's, the idea of, are we going to station more counterinsurgency forces in the region to go after them? I doubt it. No, actually. So this is why, going back to how does President-elect Trump negotiate settlements, and this is a priority, negotiate settlements to the Israel-Gaza war, Hezbollah, stabilize Lebanon. This has to be part of the program. But I don't know if you're meaning, are we going to go after the non-state armed groups inside these countries? I think it would be a matter of working with the state's army, the national security forces of the state. But I'm not clear. Excuse me?
What kind of peace?
Well, what kind of peace? One, end the conflict so that, let's start with Israel, Gaza. At minimum, end the conflict so that Israel's borders are secure and the state existence is not threatened, and that Palestinian people have rights of some form of governance and peace and prosperity. This is a complex issue to get both of them. That's why it is so important to have the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, to have other Gulf state partners involved in this. I can't see it any other way. But we didn't mention, but I have to mention, to get to that, negotiating a settlement to the Ukraine-Russia war is essential. And that will be one of the first things that President-elect Donald Trump does when he comes in. Because then what kind of leverage and negotiations can we have with great powers, and I mean Russia, to help assist in some of these other conflicts going on in the Middle East? And that's the type of bargaining. I do not see a grand bargain, but I do see these powers getting involved to help negotiate settlements. Because, President-elect Donald Trump said to Netanyahu, right, do what you have to do to these groups and get it over with quick. This is not something that anyone wants to see this going on, and that's why I do not think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has carte blanche. He can't. And you can't negotiate the Abraham Accords without Saudi Arabia, who cannot negotiate it without having some type of settlement for the Palestinians. So this is all very tied, and we recognize that there has to be. I don't know what specifically it's going to look like. So they're all linked together, in my view.
I'd like to jump in with a question here for Mr. Wang. We know that China helped bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together. Do you see a role for China going forward in adding to or negotiating any further layers of the diplomacy that's needed to bring this peace to the region? Or do you think having the Trump administration there and the extra rivalry between the US and China that we're going to see will make it hard for China to find a role in the region's diplomacy?
China plays a significant role and played a significant role between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Also, we have put forward a mechanism to ensure the sustainability of the reconciliation between, or the rapprochement between the two countries. Before yesterday, the Trilateral Council was held between the ministers of the three countries in order to cement and bolster the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement. We should dig deeper into this problem and look beyond interests. The problem between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the problem is that both Saudi Arabia and Iran realized that the reasons between their conflict for longer than 7 years. Now the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman wants something different to what happened in 2017. Now he wants to sorry, I did not get that clearly, but perhaps he said he wants to cling on to power in Saudi Arabia. Now Iran goes through very challenging circumstances, internally and externally. So both of them pivoting towards the same direction of rapprochement. That's why the intertwine, I see that the Trump impact is not quite significant on this particular file.
So if you're talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran, and Trump is exerting ultimate maximum pressure on Iran, and does Saudi Arabia go along with Trump, or will it remain under the umbrella of the Chinese-sponsored agreement that it has with Iran?
This is such a hard prediction, to make. But so far, we have seen that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is getting closer to Iran. And when he condemned what Israel has said recently, calling on condemning Israel. And I think that Saudi Arabia is more pivoted towards Iran rather than towards Israel. And he repeatedly emphasized and reiterated Mohammed bin Salman that there will never be any normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia as long as there is a lacking Palestinian statehood as a key principle. So the Saudi collaboration with the United States doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia will stand against Iran.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yes.
And I agree with some of what you said, but we don't know the terms of the agreement. One of them is, again, some role, there's got to be some attention to settling the Palestinian rights issues, without a doubt. But what are one of the things that the Saudis want as well? A special strategic relationship with the United States, a special security relationship with the United States, which to this point was, well, we don't know if we can do it. But so you have to actually see what is going to be on the table. I really believe that President-elect Trump comes to this problem set with some leverage because of the social capital that he has. And also understanding that over the last 4 years, the United States has lost significant leverage in the Middle East. We all agree to that, right? We all know that we're not in the same place that we were 4, even 5, 10 years ago. But still, these are going to be parts that, what happens in Ukraine and Russia, how does that affect Saudi Arabia, when Turkey and Syria normalize, what are the implications of this? So we have to really look at this at a strategic level and start thinking about where that's going to play into the hand that President-elect Trump has in the region.
So yes, I think we have time for a couple more questions from the audience, if there are any more here. Yes, this man here.
Thank you. Well, the Trump administration might be leaning on Israel to achieve its aims in the Middle East. We all know that the United States' influence shrunk and declined in the Middle East after it has become self-sufficient in oil, because it used to be interested in oil, protecting oil, and getting oil. Now the United States doesn't need oil. So China has become more important. But it seems that the Trump administration will be dependent solely on Israel to achieve its aims, whatever these might be. So what do you think of this analysis that Trump will be allied with Netanyahu, with the government of Israel, whatever it does, and obviously this is not going to be liked by the Arab masses and Arab countries in general? Thank you. And that is to Denise.
Thank you. The United States is self-reliant on oil, but it is interested in stable oil prices. So it can't entirely dismiss itself from the Middle East because we can rely on our own oil. So that does matter.
Well, its influence declined.
That I agree. Totally agree with you on that one. But back to allying with Israel no matter what it does. One, it's very clear. Israel will remain an essential and critical partner and ally of the United States, Democrat, Republican, there it is. But I don't agree necessarily no matter what it does, because I have to, no matter what Prime Minister Netanyahu does. That I think that there, again, I don't see him having carte blanche because President-elect Trump has to negotiate a settlement to these wars. And therefore, that is not going to mean alienating very important Arab Gulf states. It can't happen that way because you cannot have the Abraham Accords, you can't have the key tenets of what he wants to accomplish in the Middle East without having important relationships with the Arab Gulf. And quite frankly, I don't see this dichotomy because Israel's relationships, again, this war has to be stopped and ended, but Israel's relationships with the Gulf, potential Abraham Accords with Jordan, these are also maintained and they're still very important with Egypt as well. So not carte blanche for Netanyahu, very important, very critical U.S.-Israeli partnerships and relationships, but at the end of the day, end the wars.
Yes, here, thank you.
Hi, Julian Bichocha, reporter and editor for Rudao English in Erbil. My question is to Denise. Why does the U.S. not further push the Iraqi government into implementing federalism in the country as a means of eliminating Iranian-backed influence to not only bring security and stability to Iraq, but the Middle East in general, especially considering that Iran and the factions that it controls in the Iraqi parliament do not like the idea of federalism?
Thank you. The United States policy toward Iraq, though, right, is to recognize Iraq as a sovereign federal state. My understanding as well is that our diplomatic corps, that our State Department, that our military, we do work with Iraq as a federal entity. Are you meaning, should we become more involved in negotiating disputes between the Kurdistan regional government and the Iraqi government? I think that has been tried and that will be ongoing. It is in our interest to have a stable Iraq, without a doubt. But I'm not quite sure what else you think that we should be doing.
It's not just between the KRG and Baghdad, but also not just with the Shiite, but with the Sunnis too, federalism in general. Why doesn't the U.S. see that as a lasting resolution to Iranian-backed influence in Iraq?
Well, one, there's an Iraqi constitution, so we work with the Iraqi government. We recognize the sovereignty of the Iraqi government and what that political institution and what that structure is. We work with the Iraqi officials to implement that. So, I mean, that is one aspect of it. We don't need to see a weak, unstable Iraq. Probably Iran would like to see a destabilized Iraq. Not Iraq at war, but a destabilized Iraq. So it is in our interest to see a strong, self-sufficient, security-wise Iraqi state, and of course one that, But the Iraqi Federalist Project, let's be clear, that was flawed from the outset. So there's only, it's the best of an imperfect world, but there's only, there's a lot of weaknesses in the way that federal system was set up. And I think, in my view, people are trying to deal with that now. Quota systems, the whole bit. We don't have time to talk about the problems of federalism.
And I think that's all the questions that we have time for, because I want to ask the panelists if there's anything that's arisen from this conversation that they didn't have a chance to say or that we didn't come to, just very quickly. And then I'm going to hand over to Renad Mansour for some closing comments. So yes, starting with you, Krikor, is there any interjections?
There is, and over the course of these 2 days, we have spoken about peace, we have spoken about Iran, but in this conflict there are two sides. And I cannot remember, I might have not been or didn't take part in some of the sessions that this issue was discussed. There is a conflict that started on October 7th. Early on, the Americans and the Europeans reached out to Iraq with the message, we want to contain this conflict, we want to end this war, and we want to make sure that Iraq is not dragged into this conflict. The Iraqi government strongly agreed. As I said, it's a legal issue. We can only talk to one side of the conflict, and we engage them head-on, always trying to de-escalate, to end the conflict, and not to expand it. On the other hand, we keep seeing that the goalpost by the other side keeps moving. Strategic objectives keeps changing, strategic military objectives. Gaza is leveled to the ground. We see what borders crimes against humanity. We see the erosion of a rule-based international world order right in front of our eyes, declaring the UN Secretary General a persona non grata, attacking peacekeeping forces, attacking states, and now threatening to attack Iraq, citing Resolution 1546, that the letter and the spirit of the resolution is about protecting the sovereignty of Iraq and keeping Iraq intact. And by the way, the letter that went to the Security Council, citing 1546, has been violated by Israel twice. In 2019, by an attack, and when they attacked Iran the last time. Also, we see a new phenomena that we can't understand, and the government is deeply worried, because in an unjust and unfair system, you can never have peace and stability. Since when do we cherry pick and select certain UN Security Council resolutions and violate others? There's a long list. There's a state that can say, I want this one and this one and this one to be implemented, while violating a long list of UN Security Council resolutions. As they say, it takes two to tango. And I've seen that the Israeli government's behavior has not been focused upon enough in this conference and in this session. This is a source of grave concern for Iraq that wants to maintain its stability and sees that any country, any responsible member of the international community must have an interest in a rule-based international world order if it wants to live in peace, stability, and prosper economically. But I would argue, more than any other state, Western states and the United States of America has a vested interest in maintaining such an order, because it enables it, gives it a competitive edge on the world stage to project influence. I'm sorry, I've taken too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, a very important question. Mohammed, I'd like to ask you if you have any thoughts about any of this that we should have touched on.
I think there are still some, not taboos, but things that are difficult to consider and really analytically engage with. And I think one of these things that comes up with Trump, and this is one of the good things about Trump, is that there can really be a conversation had about the U.S., both directly and indirectly, for instance, through its support of Israel, being a real source of instability in the region. It's never really countered that way, right? I think a lot of the time the focus on instability comes from other sources, but if you look at the U.S. as potentially being destabilizing, and you have a more honest conversation about what can really be done, Krikor talks about the rules-based order, and the question arises, who makes the rules? And how are they applied? And I think for most people in the region, looking at Ukraine, looking at Gaza in the past few years, it's clear that the rules are not universal. And it's certainly not Arabs who are writing them, right? So I think this is a bigger conversation, that somebody like Trump coming in makes it more difficult for other actors like Europe, for instance, to kind of say that, go along with it, right? So I think this is something, a bigger thing to look at. Another thing that came up to me now during this conversation was the vastly disparate perceptions that I see come from U.S. perspective versus, for instance, Iranian perspective. We talk about Saudi Arabia and Trump having, this massive social capital. What I'm seeing, what I've encountered from Gulf Arabs, they don't take U.S. security commitments seriously at all. 2019 was a shock to them. They don't trust the U.S. to hold its word. And we see this practically, the effect of it, in the fact that they want to engage with Iran, they want to normalize with Iran, not because they think suddenly Iran is great. MBS referred to Khamenei, the supreme leader, as Hitler 5 years ago, right? It's this notion that we can't change our geography and we're stuck with our neighbors and we have to make, good with them somehow. I think this is another thing to really look at the different perspectives and really take it to heart and try to find different solutions.
Denise, do you have something to say?
Sure. Yeah, just a couple final points. It seems in the questions that you get, what's going to happen when President-elect Trump comes in? There's going to be all these changes. And it's just so, look, this is, there's going to be a lot of continuity. I mean, some of these, the way that, again, I emphasize, American foreign policy is not changing catastrophically with President-elect Trump. The wars that we are in now all occurred when someone was following the rules-based order. President-elect Trump is inheriting 2 wars or more. So, there's a good reason to believe that this is a way to end these wars. And I want to, you hear a lot about isolationism. This is going to be a foreign policy of isolation. I don't really get that. Not in getting engaged in external, liberal interventionism does not mean you're isolationist. There's just going to be a very different way that the United States engages with the world, but there will be partnerships. Look at NATO. NATO thanks us today because NATO's stronger today than it was 3 years ago because they have to increase their defense spending. So there are going to be different expectations of our partners, but those partnerships, I think of the AUKUS agreement, this is going to be still very, very important. And I see more of a personal engagement of President Trump in trying to resolve these conflicts because of the personal relationships that he has. So, people can say, well, it may be a low bar, but we're at least in a place where we can start looking at how can we end these conflicts. How can we end it? Because we're nowhere in sight right now. Thanks.
And so, yes, Mr. Wang, a final word. What's China's perspective on this? And China does try and present a different perspective to the one that is the US-led perspective, and maybe you have something to say about that.
Today, we discuss hard to find definitive answers in a changing world. And one of the reasons to uncertainty is Trump. I wish for Iraq more independence, strength, and self-reliance. And I also wish for the Iraqi-Chinese relationships more horizons, and thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to the wonderful panelists, and thank you to you all. And please don't get up. Renat, our leader, is going to come and say some final remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Liz. Just very briefly, to conclude, thank you to all the speakers, to all the participants for coming today. It's great to have policymakers from the region, from Europe, the US, elsewhere, sitting with academics, sitting with civil society and others, and really debating these crucial domestic and foreign policy issues. Every year, as part of the Iraq Initiative, this is the goal, to make sure that it's the afternoon right now and the room is still full. And we are discussing Iraq, and we're discussing Iraq at a critical juncture for the region as well as for the country. And we will continue to engage with you all on these issues. I also would like to thank really wholeheartedly the Chatham House team. Thank you to Rennie, Georgia, Isra, Basim, Nicole, Noor, Izzy, and the AV team and others for really putting this on, making this such a success, as well as to Haidar Shakiri, my colleague, for being my partner in a lot of this work. I meant to also say, please, there will be feedback on your badges. Please offer any feedback you have so that we could improve this. And certainly to thank very special our sponsors that really make this happen, Crescent Petroleum, Majid, and others working on the team, the Suwaidi family, and this year also working with the British Institute for the Study of Iraq and the British Council that really allows these discussions over the last 2 days to continue. And without further ado, I want to welcome you all to go upstairs. We invite you to go upstairs to engage with a video art exhibition that we have curated with the Ruya Foundation to offer a sort of different perspective on some of these issues and alternative. So please do go up, and there will be drinks and snacks as well. Thank you so much again to everyone, and see you next year, inshallah. Thank you.